One of the things that was most moving to me on my trip to Israel shortly after October 7th was when we went to Machane Shura, which is an army base where Zakah, who are the Chevre Kadisha people who are mostly army reservists in their 50s and 60s who come back in to the army after that terrible day on October 7th, and they're basically there to identify all of the bodies. And being in that place where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bodies of both civilians and soldiers are being identified, what we saw there was something that you don't actually see that often in Israel, which are wooden caskets. Because in Israel, most people are buried in tachritin, in a burial shroud, and put straight into the ground. But when soldiers die in combat in Israel, they are buried in their uniforms in a wooden casket. In their uniforms, in a wooden casket. And the reason is because of the blood. Because this whole notion that we've been reading about so much today, about shfichut damim, which is the spilling of blood, and the fact that the blood is the nefesh. And in the Torah it's mostly talking about animals, but there's something so powerful about blood that when it comes to burial of an Israeli soldier who's died in combat, they are buried with as much of their blood as is possible, which is, for various reasons I'm not going to dwell on, incredibly powerful and moving to me. But I want to talk for a few minutes about this notion of blood and nefesh. What does it mean that the blood is the nefesh? There are a few places where we talk about blood, not just in this parsha, but the power of blood. One of the first references to blood is after the first murder that we see, right, where Cain murders his brother Abel. And afterwards the Torah says, Damei achicha soakim alai min adama. The bloods of your brother are crying out to me from the ground. There's a link, which I only discovered today, between that story and what we read in the Torah today. This mitzvah of if you kill a wild animal or a bird, and this idea that you are meant to drain all of their blood and then bury the blood, which we talked briefly about earlier on, is considered to be an amazingly important mitzvah. And in fact, it's such an important mitzvah. There's this idea, you're not just like, kicking a little bit of earth over the blood. You're supposed to actually get down on your knees and take earth with your hands and bury the blood, because the blood is considered to be so important. There's various interpretations about why. Harav Kook, the chief rabbi of Palestine under the British Mandate, he said that the reason that we bury the blood is because we're showing that we're actually ashamed that we have to eat animals at all and that we're not all vegans. But I'm not going to dwell on that. But that is a commentary of his. But there's this incredibly powerful midrash in Bereshit Rabbah that actually says that because we're talking about wild animals and birds in the parsha that we just read, there is this midrash that the wild animals and the birds buried Abel after his brother killed him. And the reward for what wild animals and birds did, the reward is that when their blood is shed, they have their blood buried by the people who shed their blood. There's something incredibly powerful about that idea. First of all, it shows us, and by the way, all of this is coming from Rabbi David Seidenberg, who many of you know because he's visited us here, but in his book, Kabbalah and Ecology, he talks a lot about relationship with the divine in the more than human world. And so this expansive idea of the natural world, the expansive idea of the natural world is not just made up by Midrash and by David Seidenberg. It's right there. If it's talking so much in the Torah about the nefesh, the soul of this animal being in its blood, and the importance of having to cover up that blood, it must mean so much. And of course we could talk a lot about our relationships with the earth, our relationship with the animals. And of course, fundamentally, it's also about our relationships with other human beings. There's a lot of blood being spilled in the world right now, right? And so if that blood, whether it's Palestinian blood or Jewish blood, Israeli blood, Ukrainian blood, Russian blood, Adam, the human being, has dam in it. Part of humanity is that we have blood coursing through our veins. But every life, every mammal, every mammalian life has blood coursing through its veins. So what is it that the nefesh, every human and every animal has a nefesh. And so when blood is spilt, as it inevitably is, whether it's to kill an animal to eat its meat, or whether it's the casualties of war, there's something about that idea of covering up the blood, not just because of shame, although perhaps Rav Kook is onto something. Perhaps if we're burying people that we've killed in war, there's a sense of like desperation and shame that this had to happen somehow and that we took a human life. But there's something more. As I said before, this parsha and next week's parsha in many years are read together. But this year they're read separately because we have the leap year and an extra month. So they're separated out. But at the beginning of next week's parsha of Kedoshim, there is one of the most important mitzvahs that we have in the Torah. Al ta'amod al dam re'echa. Don't stand on the blood of your fellow, right? Don't stand on your fellow, on your neighbor's blood. That is taken as an extraordinarily important ethical principle about just not standing idly by when blood is being spilt. And the idea of standing, if I was to stand on my neighbor's blood, like as if to say, oh, there's blood on here, but I'm not going to, it's so different to like actually getting down on my hands and knees and using my hands to bury the blood. And there's something very powerful, I think, about that contrast. So on the one hand, we have Damei achicha soakim alai mi'al adamah, the bloods of your brother are crying out to me from the earth, says God to Cain after he's killed his brother. And then we have this injunction that if you eat the blood, or if you don't bury the blood, then you're going to be cut off from the community, the Torah says. And don't stand by on the blood of your neighbor. There's a few different mitzvot that come in here, but kisei dam is the covering up of blood, is an important mitzvah. But according to Rabbi Seidenberg, this is all part of an incredible culture and halachic practice around kavod hadam, honoring the blood. Honoring the blood wherever and however it's been spilt, whether it's human blood or whether it's animal blood. There's something about the integrity of the human being is somehow in that blood. I want to take it beyond its literal meaning about blood. We started this last week our weekly learning of Pirkei Avot, the traditional passages that we learn between Pesach and Shavuot. Amazing passages. Last Wednesday evening we learned the first chapter. This Wednesday evening we'll be learning the second chapter, 7 o'clock on Zoom. Everyone's welcome to join. But the very first Mishnah of the second chapter, which is this week's chapter of Pirkei Avot, has Rabbi. Rabbi is Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who is the person who is considered to be responsible for putting together the Mishnah. He sort of redacted the Mishnah in Sipori in the 2nd century. And Rabbi Omer, Eizo hi derech yishara sheya'avor lo ha'adam kol shehi tiferet lo oseha v'tiferet lo min ha'adam. So first of all, he's asking a question. What is the derech yeshara? What is the straight path that a human should walk on? And the answer is any path that brings tiferet. Tiferet can be translated in a lot of different ways. In this translation, it's translated as honor, but it can also mean beauty. It can mean balance. It can mean harmony. Brings honor to the person walking the path, and to the honor and to tiferet on others. But then he says, "Veheve zahir b'mitzvah kala k'vachamora she'ein ata yodea matan sechran shel mitzvot." Very, very important teaching. He says, be as careful, as scrupulous, as diligent in a kala, in a light or apparently unimportant mitzvah, as you would be in a chamorah, in a very heavy and more serious mitzvah, because you don't actually know what the reward is for a mitzvah. I want to extend this back to this idea of this mitzvah, which for the rabbis is considered extremely important, to cover up blood that has been spilled, and say, do we know, is that a mitzvah kala or a mitzvah chamorah? Is it light or is it important? Some would argue it's light, some would argue it's important, but the point is, if there is a power and a quality of reverence for that mitzvah, it seems that should apply to every mitzvah. So every time we have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, and we may think it's something minor and superficial and insignificant, we do it with the same integrity and the same reverence and the same seriousness as if we were actually burying the blood that has been spilled of a human or of an animal. We are living in a world that feels so perilous and so frightening in so many different ways. And for me, one of the things, especially in the face of anti-Semitism, one of the things that I think is so important is for us to get connected to what our tradition demands of us. And our tradition demands of us to have a scrupulous way in which we look at these mitzvot. The mitzvot that are ben adam lechavero, the mitzvot that are between people, the ethical mitzvot, the ways in which we treat each other, the mitzvot that are ben adam la'atzmi, between a person and themselves, the ways in which we take care of our own bodies and souls, and the mitzvot that are ben adam lemakom, that are between a person and God, that our spiritual lives, our physical lives, that every single opportunity we have to keep a mitzvah, whether apparently minor or serious, we do it with zahirut. Heves zahir. Be really, really scrupulous and mindful. Be vigilant. Be careful. I think that's part of the antidote to living in this frightening world right now, is to just recognize that our tradition has many, many, many mitzvot that we have the opportunity to do, and that we don't even decide which is important and which is unimportant. If we are on a path and we have an opportunity to do a mitzvah, it could be visiting someone in hospital or making a meal for someone who's recovering from surgery, or it could be some major thing. It could be like bringing peace to the Middle East, or bringing peace to Boulder City Council, there are so many different ways in which each of us, and we each have our own individual circumstances because we all are different and unique. We have opportunities. And it could be that we are literally or figuratively actually covering up blood. Not because we're ashamed, but because we recognize the sanctity of life, both human and animal. And that when the Torah says, as it did in the part we read today, chai bahem, live by them, live through them. It's telling us that these mitzvot are to live by, not to die by. So we're not putting our lives at risk by keeping mitzvot, but we're sometimes saving lives, and maybe we're even saving our own lives by keeping the mitzvot, whether light or serious. I think that's all I want to say. Shabbat Shalom.